How you been, Joey?
Hello? Good to see you.
How'd all these people get in your room?
You're gonna start already, huh?
No, I'm not starting.
How are you?
I'm almost through.
Late-night television used to be dangerous, and Johnny Carson's desk was right on the front line. Before cue cards, delays, and media training took over, Hollywood stars walked on to The Tonight Show carrying secrets, grudges, and sometimes a whole lot of alcohol. Some guests didn't sip discreetly backstage. They arrived already drunk, glassy-eyed, and barely holding it together, moments before millions of viewers tuned in. And once the cameras rolled, there was no escape. Johnny Carson kept smiling, cracking jokes, and steering conversations, but behind that calm exterior were interviews balanced on the edge of total disaster. Words slurred. Stories went nowhere. Jokes landed wrong. Silence filled the studio in ways no laugh track could fix. What audiences laughed at in the moment often left producers panicking and executives furious the next morning. These weren't anonymous guests either. They were Hollywood icons, comedy legends, and award-winning stars who thought the rules of live television didn't apply to them. Some treated Carson's couch like a bar stool, using the show to party in public. Others unraveled slowly during the interview, revealing just how much they'd had before stepping on stage. A few crossed lines so badly that they were quietly banned from returning. No announcement, no explanation, just erased from the booking list. And in rare moments, even Johnny himself looked uncomfortable. Forced to rescue the show before it collapsed on live TV. What makes these moments shocking isn't just the drinking, it's how close America came to watching complete meltdown in real time. Careers were damaged. Reputations cracked. And in some cases, one drunk appearance followed a star for the rest of their life. These weren't bloopers edited out later. This was raw, unpredictable television when anything could happen, and sometimes did. So buckle up. Because once you see who showed up drunk, how far things went, and why Johnny Carson handled it better than anyone else ever could, you'll realize something surprising. Classic late night wasn't safer than today. It was far more dangerous. And these guests proved it, one drink at a time. Before Johnny Carson ever sat behind that polished desk, late-night television was still figuring out its own rules, and alcohol was quietly part of the culture. Comics drank to loosen up, actors drank to calm nerves, and singers drank because that was simply the town they came from. By the time Carson took over The Tonight Show, the habit had already followed Hollywood onto the soundstage. The difference was that now, everything was live, unscripted, and impossible to take back. Johnny understood immediately that the real danger wasn't bad jokes, it was unpredictability. A sober guest might stumble over a punchline. A drunk guest could derail the entire broadcast in seconds. Still, Carson never lectured, never scolded, and never embarrassed his visitors. Instead, he perfected a survival skill that few hosts have ever mastered, making chaos look intentional. Some nights, Johnny could smell the booze before the guest even sat down. Slurred introductions. Miscues. That extra long laugh that didn't quite make sense. The audience might not catch it at first, but Carson always did. He adjusted his pace, shortened questions, or jumped in with a joke designed to quietly regain control. To viewers at home, it all felt smooth. Behind the cameras, producers were sweating. What shocked staff the most was how often this happened with big names. These weren't desperate newcomers hoping for attention. They were established stars who believed the rules didn't apply to them. A few even treated the green room like happy hour, assuming Carson would clean up whatever mess they made. And most of the time, he did. But there were limits. As the years went on, patterns became impossible to ignore. Certain guests always arrived a little louder than before. Stories stretched longer. Punchlines disappeared entirely. Carson rarely called it out directly, but sometimes his raised eyebrow or sideways glance to Ed McMahon said everything. Those subtle reactions became legendary because they were the only warning viewers got that something was wrong. The real pressure came from the network. Executives hated risk, and drunk guests were nothing but risk. One wrong comment could bring angry phone calls, sponsor complaints, or worse. Yet Carson argued that unpredictability was part of the show's magic. He believed audiences tuned in because anything might happen. That belief kept the doors open. until someone pushed too far that not every incident ended in laughter. A few interviews went off the rails so badly that producers stepped in mid-show, cutting segments short or rushing to commercial. Names disappeared from future booking lists without explanation. No public bans. No headlines. Just silence. In Hollywood, that silence spoke louder than any press release. What made Johnny different was how personally he took it. He wasn't angry at drunk guests, he was disappointed. He saw the show as a privilege, not a playground. When someone treated it carelessly, he never forgot. His polite smile remained, but trust was gone. Insiders later admitted there were celebrities Johnny simply refused to have back, no matter how famous they were, and yet the audience loved those nights. The tension, the awkward pauses, the feeling that something might explode at any moment, it made live television electric. People tuned in not just to laugh, but to watch Johnny steady the ship while waves crashed over the desk. These moments created legends. The couch became famous not just for great interviews, but for near disasters survived in real time. And as you'll see next, some guests didn't just push the boundaries, they obliterated them, leaving Johnny Carson to rescue the show with nothing but timing, instinct, and nerves of steel. If one name defined alcohol-fueled danger on Johnny Carson's couch, it was Dean Martin. By the time he walked onto The Tonight Show, Dean wasn't pretending anymore. The drink wasn't a rumor, a backstage whisper, or a nervous habit. It was part of the act. The glass in his hand might have been a prop, or it might not have been. And that uncertainty was exactly what made producers uneasy, and audiences glued to their TVs. Dean didn't stumble onto the set. He sauntered. Loose shoulders, heavy eyelids, smile just slow enough to suggest he was already ahead of the room. The moment he sat down, Johnny knew what kind of night it was going to be. Questions would wander. Answers would derail. Punchlines would land late or not at all. But Carson never shut him down. He adjusted, letting Dean roam just enough to keep it entertaining without letting the show collapse. What made Dean different from everyone else was confidence. He wasn't embarrassed by how he sounded. He leaned into it. Slurred speech became a rhythm. Missed beats turned into laughs. When jokes fell flat, Dean didn't correct himself. He simply moved on, glass lifted, grin intact. Audiences loved the rebellion of it. Networks hated the lack of control. Behind the scenes, things were far less charming. Crew members dreaded Dean's visits. Timing became impossible. Segment lengths stretched unpredictably. Cue cards were useless. Cameras stayed wide longer than usual because no one knew where the conversation was headed. Every appearance felt like it could tip into disaster at any second. Johnny's role shifted from host to handler. He interrupted more gently than usual. He tossed soft questions instead of sharp setups. When Dean lost his train of thought, Johnny filled the silence before it became uncomfortable. It was subtle, but if you watch closely, you could see the extra effort, the way Carson leaned forward, the way his tone slowed, the way his jokes doubled as guardrails, and there were moments when even Johnny's patience thinned. On a few occasions, Dean's stories dissolved entirely. He'd start a sentence, drift halfway through, and abandon it without noticing. Laughter carried him through, but Johnny's smiles tightened. The audience may not have realized it, but they were watching a master class in damage control. One wrong move and the interview could have turned from funny to painful in seconds. Despite the chaos, Dean kept getting invited back. Why? Ratings. Audiences tuned in because he was unpredictable. There was a thrill in watching a legend toe the line between charm and collapse. Executives complained, but the numbers answered for them. As long as Dean stayed on the entertaining side of drunk, the risk was tolerated. Not everyone approved. Fellow guests sometimes looked uncomfortable waiting backstage, realizing they'd have to follow whatever had just unfolded. Some felt Dean's behavior cheapened the show. Others secretly admired it, proof that rules could be bent on live television if you were famous enough. Johnny himself never openly criticized Dean, but insiders later said Carson saw the situation clearly. Dean wasn't playing to the audience anymore, he was playing to himself. Still, Carson respected him enough not to humiliate him on air. That restraint is what kept those interviews watchable instead of tragic. Dean Martin became the standard by which all later drunk guest appearances were judged. Funny, yes. Iconic, absolutely. but also a warning. Because not everyone who followed could pull it off, and some would learn painfully that Johnny's couch had limits no amount of charm could erase. Orson Welles didn't arrive on Johnny Carson's stage like a troublemaker. He arrived like royalty-heavy footsteps, booming voice, and an ego that filled the studio before he even sat down. Audiences expected brilliance. What they sometimes got instead was confusion, rambling, and a man clearly wrestling with more than just his thoughts. When Orson had been drinking, brilliance and disaster sat uncomfortably close together. Unlike Dean Martin, Orson didn't wear alcohol as costume. There. Carson treated Orson with a different kind of care. This wasn't about controlling chaos. It was about preserving dignity. Orson Welles was a genius, a legend, a man whose reputation deserved protection, even when he made that task almost impossible. Johnny softened his questions, avoided sharp turns in conversation, and gave Orson time to find his footing. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it didn't. Single quotes Tito. One appearance became infamous among staff. Orson began a story with complete confidence, launched into details no one could follow, then abruptly stopped, eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the studio lights. Seconds stretched on. Laughter died. The silence wasn't funny. It was uncomfortable, even sad. Johnny jumped in with a joke to relieve the tension, but the moment lingered like smoke in the room. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged looks. This wasn't entertaining unpredictability. This was a legend unraveling in real time. Alcohol had blurred Orson's usually razor-sharp mind, and live television offered no safety net. Johnny did everything he could, prompting gently, steering conversations back to familiar ground, but Orson kept drifting off course. What made Orson's appearances so painful wasn't embarrassment, it was vulnerability. The audience wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were watching a brilliant man struggle to maintain control. That kind of discomfort hit Johnny harder than loud drunks or rude guests ever could. Carson valued wit and intelligence above all else, and seeing it slip away troubled him deeply. Still, Johnny never cut Orson off harshly. He never rushed him out the way other hosts might have. Instead, he became a quiet partner, filling gaps with humor, clapping at the end of stories that never quite finished, and pretending everything was fine. To viewers, it may have seemed respectful. To those who worked on the show, it was nerve-wracking. After those interviews aired, the reaction was divided. Some fans defended Orson, claiming his style was always unconventional. Others felt uncomfortable seeing him in that state. Network executives were less forgiving. Alcohol plus unpredictability plus intellectual rambling was a sponsor's nightmare. Conversations happened behind closed doors about whether Orson was too much of a risk. Johnny resisted blame, but he didn't forget. Future bookings became rare. When Orson did appear again, everything was tightly controlled. Shorter segments, safer topics, less room to wander. Johnny had learned that Orson, when drinking, didn't explode like other guests, he dissolved. And that kind of slow collapse was even harder to watch. What set these moments apart from every other drunk appearance was tone. There was no wild laughter, no circus energy. Just the quiet unraveling of a giant. Johnny's reaction said everything. His smile stayed, but it softened. His jokes became protective shields rather than punchlines. It was one of the few times viewers could see Carson acting less like a host and more like a caretaker. Those interviews left a mark on the show's legacy. They proved that alcohol didn't always create chaos, it could create sadness. And Johnny, more than anyone, understood the weight of that. He believed audiences deserved honesty, but not cruelty disguised as entertainment. Orson Welles on The Tonight Show became a reminder. Legends are human. Genius can falter, and live television has no pause button. Johnny Carson handled those moments with as much grace as anyone could, but even he couldn't save everything. And coming up next, you'll see a guest whose drinking didn't fade quietly. It detonated, leaving everyone in the studio stunned. There was drunk. And then there was Rip Torn. No guest ever pushed Johnny Carson closer to true on-air crisis than him. By the time Rip walked onto the Tonight Show stage, something felt off immediately. This wasn't the relaxed looseness of a few drinks or the playful swagger audiences we're used to seeing. This was volatility, tight smiles, sharp eyes, an energy that didn't quite match the room. At first, Johnny treated Rip like any other guest. Calm questions. Easy pacing. A gentle tone designed to settle nerves. But instead of easing in, Rip grew more erratic with every minute. His answers didn't just wander, they collided. He interrupted Johnny, talked over punchlines, and reacted to harmless questions as if they were personal attacks. The laughter in the studio became uneven, unsure whether to come or stay silent. Alcohol had stripped away Rip's filter, and what remained was anger barely disguised as humor. He leaned forward aggressively, voice rising, eyes locking onto Johnny in ways that made the crew uneasy. This wasn't a performance. Johnny sensed it instantly. His posture changed. His jokes shortened. He began steering the interview toward quicker transitions, hoping to end it before something truly bad happened. But Rip wasn't following the script or any script at one point. He lashed out verbally, accusing Johnny of disrespect that simply wasn't there. The room froze. Johnny's smile faltered for a split second, an eternity in live television. The audience laughed nervously, unsure if they'd just witnessed a joke or the beginning of something dangerous. Carson responded with humor, but it was defensive now, designed to cool the temperature rather than entertain. Behind the scenes, producers were panicking. Fingers hovered near commercial buttons. Security discreetly moved closer to the stage. No guest had ever made the environment feel this unpredictable. Rip wasn't just drunk, he was confrontational, unstable, and clearly past the point where charm could rescue him. Johnny did what he always did best. He contained the situation. He wrapped jokes around Rip's outbursts, reframed insults as misunderstandings, and slowly shortened the interview without making it obvious. Every second became a calculated move. One wrong word could have turned a tense exchange into a headline-making disaster. When the segment finally ended, the applause felt forced relief more than appreciation. Johnny thanked Rip and moved on quickly, never looking back. The show continued, but the mood had shifted. Staff members later said the air felt heavy for the rest of the night, as if everyone knew they had narrowly avoided something far worse. After the broadcast, the consequences were swift and silent. Rip Torn was never invited back. No public explanation. No controversy addressed on air. In Carson's world, that silence meant everything. The show didn't punish people publicly, it erased them. And in Hollywood, that kind of erasure was final. What made this appearance different from all the others wasn't the drinking itself. Johnny had dealt with drunk guests before, funny ones, sloppy ones, tragic ones. This was the first time alcohol had turned an interview openly hostile. It shattered the unspoken trust between host and guest, the understanding that no matter how wild things got, respect would remain. Johnny later admitted privately that the moment rattled him. Not because he felt threatened personally, but because it crossed a line. The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual. A shared agreement between performer, host, and audience. Rip Torn broke that agreement live on camera. From that point forward, producers became stricter. Green rooms were watched more closely. Staff paid attention to behavior before guests ever walked on stage. The era of unchecked risk began to close, not because the audience disliked chaos, but because chaos had finally shown its teeth. Looking back, Rip Torn's appearance became a turning point. It proved that live television wasn't invincible. Johnny Carson wasn't unshakable. And alcohol, when mixed with ego and anger, could turn entertainment into something genuinely frightening. Johnny saved the show that night, but only barely. And the lesson stuck. The couch might forgive slurred words, wandering stories, even foolish behavior. But the moment danger entered the room, Johnny Carson knew exactly where to draw the line.